Hey everyone, today I'm super excited to release the announcement of my latest course, Building a Shopping App with Next.js, NestJS, and Prisma. This course is now complete with over 8 hours of content on how to build a modern full-stack web application with Next.js and NestJS, following best practices using the latest app directory approach in Next.js. In my opinion, it is the best way to build a full-stack web app today. So I'd like to leave you with a sample of the course in this video. Of course, if you'd like to check it out, I will leave links in the description and the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you really enjoy it. Thanks. Hey there, thanks so much for checking out this course, Building a Shopping App with Next.js, NestJS, and Prisma. In this course, we're going to look to see the best practices on how to build a modern Next.js application using the latest and greatest app directory approach. We're going to build an e-commerce shopping app where we can actually purchase products and see them in real time thanks to the Stripe payment integration as well as WebSockets. We're going to learn so much in this course. By the end of it, you're going to be able to actually build your own full stack web applications using Next.js and NestJS, which is an excellent stack when you're trying to build production-grade, scalable web applications. So enough talking, let's go ahead and jump in to see what we're actually going to be building in this course. All right, so I've navigated to the production project URL that we're building in this course. I've called it Shoppy, which is our e-commerce shopping application. Now, this is all hosted on AWS, set up with continuous delivery pipelines, CI/CD, so that whenever we push a commit to this project, we automatically build and deploy it to this production URL. So you're going to learn how to do this in this course, as well as set up production continuous delivery pipelines for our UI as well. We have JWT authentication protecting our UI as well as our backend application, so we can sign up for new user accounts or log in with existing user and authenticate using JWT. So once we're inside, we can see the product listing out all of the products we have. Right now, I've just created some sample products. So we have the ability to create new products. So I've gone ahead and created a sample one, and we also can upload images, which are going to get uploaded directly to AWS S3 for persistent object storage. Now, before I go ahead and create this product, I'll go ahead and log in on a separate browser here so I can show you what happens in real time. As soon as I add this new product, you can see it's been updated on both of the clients here. And that's because we have a WebSocket connection to our backend that's alerting all clients whenever a new product is added. So we also have the ability to view our products and purchase them, which is going to redirect to a Stripe hosted payment gateway. So in here, we can go ahead and provide test payment information to go ahead and check this product out. So I've gone ahead and provided test payment details. So I'm going to go ahead and purchase this product using our Stripe integration. So as soon as we do this, you can see our second client here is updated and the product has now been removed. And that's because we've actually updated in our database that the product is sold because we received a Stripe webhook notifying us of successful payment. So we're going to learn all of this in this course and how to set up this Next.js and NestJS backend set up with WebSockets, Stripe integration, and continuous delivery. We're going to learn so much on how to build Next.js applications following best practices. So I hope you're really excited to jump in and learn more. So one final thing I want to show you with this course in particular that I'm really excited about is that for each and every lecture that you can find in this course, so for example, if we look at this server action lecture here and scroll down, we of course, as always, I'll be including starting and ending branches for every lecture in the GitHub repository that will be given to you. So you can compare your code to the starting and end of every lecture and work through any problems. You of course can leave Q&A here as well if you have any problems. But the section I'm most excited about is the new resources section that will accompany every lecture. And this resource section is where I will include any applicable documentation in Next.js or NestJS, where you can actually read the documentation that the lecture is based around. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to read the documentation and get a good understanding of the concepts that we're trying to understand in the lecture. And then we'll be able to immediately apply them in real practice in the actual project. So by following through and always reading the resources section, you're going to be able to get so much more out of this course. So I hope you're excited to go ahead and get started with the course. There's so much to learn about Next.js and the benefits of combining it with a scalable production grade NestJS backend. Let's jump right in and see how we can do that. I'll see you there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started in building our Next.js UI. So we're going to leverage the Next.js automatic installation tool called Create Next App, and is very similar to bootstrapping with Create React App if you've ever used that before. So I'm going to go ahead and then run npx create next app at latest to create our Next.js app on the latest version. For the project name, I'm going to go ahead and call this Shoppy UI. You can call it whatever you would like. Then we'll select the defaults for the rest of the choices. So we're going to use TypeScript, ESLint to lint our code, Tailwind CSS, which is a CSS utility library. We'll choose yes. We'll go ahead and not use a source directory, just have everything in the root. Next, we're going to go ahead and importantly choose to use the app router approach, which is the recommended way to build a Next.js application, opposed to using the pages router. So the app router is how we're actually going to route requests in our application and controls how we build our components out. The app router is the modern recommended approach to do this. So we're going to go ahead and choose yes. Go ahead and select no to customize the default import alias, and then let all of your dependencies go ahead and get installed. So you can see our project has successfully created. Now we can cd into our UI, and let's go ahead and open up a code editor in this project. All right, so now I'm in VS Code and looking at the application. Let's take a quick look at what Create Next App has actually created for us. So this is going to go ahead and create all the files we need to actually initialize our application. Of course, we have a package JSON, which includes some scripts we can use to build, start, and run our application in development mode. So this is important. And of course, we have our dependencies in here. We then have a few files to configure TypeScript, so a tsconfig, and then a Tailwind configuration, which is our styling engine to tell it where to look for our components to actually render. We have some more CSS configuration, and then we have a Next.js configuration. Right now it's completely empty. However, this allows us to configure our Next.js application. Finally, we have an ESLint to extend the recommended Next Core Web Vitals, which is a set of linting rules for our Next.js app. And then we finally come to our important folders here. So we have public, where any of our assets are going to be hosted. So in this case, we have a couple of SVGs right now in here. And then finally, we have our actual app folder, which is where our code for our application is going to be sitting. So right now, we simply have a global CSS file, which is including some default CSS for the starter components. So we have two starter components here, a layout.tsx and a page.tsx. Let's go ahead and firstly see what these look like by going back to our terminal and actually starting up our Next.js development server. So we're going to go ahead and run npm run dev to start our development server on localhost 3001. So next up, I've actually navigated in my browser to localhost 3001, where we can see the default Next.js application and see that our application is starting up and rendering successfully. So this is great. We can actually see our dev server serving up our Next.js application. Now, of course, we have hot reloading out of the box, so any changes we make to our UI will be automatically refreshed on the web browser here. So next up, I want to go over the app directory further. So we know the app directory is where we're actually going to host all of the code for our Next.js app. It's important to know that Next.js in its routing, it uses a file system based router, and the actual folder names within side of this app directory are used to define the routes. So each name of the folder is going to correspond to a route segment that maps to a URL segment. So later on, we're going to have a auth route where we're going to have a login and sign up component. So in order to accomplish that, right, we create an auth folder for an auth route, and then a login folder for the login route. At that point, we would then be able to navigate in our application to /auth/login, and we would see our components there. However, of course, we don't have anything rendered yet, so we're going to get a 404. So this is important to note because it explains why we're actually rendering this current page.tsx, right? This is the actual JSX we're seeing on the home screen on our actual starting Next.js app. This is the code that's being rendered. And the reason this is the case is because we have these two special file types. We have a page.tsx and a layout.tsx. Now, by default, this page.tsx has to be inside of each route folder that we create in our app, and this is the entry point for that route. So this page.tsx, well, since we're at the root of the application, it's going to render this root page.tsx. So a page is this UI that is unique to a specific route. And if we wanted further pages, we just simply add a new folder and add a page.tsx inside of that folder, which we will do later on. So a page.tsx is actually required to make a given route publicly accessible. So in addition to this page.tsx, which is rendering our home screen right now, we also have the idea of a layout.tsx. Now, a layout is a UI that is actually shared between multiple routes. So whenever we navigate, these layout components actually get preserved. Their state gets preserved, they remain interactive, and they don't re-render. So the key to these layout components is that they accept this children prop, which will be populated with a child layout in a sub route if it exists, or a page during rendering. In this case, of course, since we're outputting the root HTML and body tags, the children prop here is going to be the root page component that hosts our existing homepage JSX right now. However, as we start to build out other routes and include other layout components, that's what will end up being populated here. And we're going to start to see this chain of nested hierarchical layout components, each with their own shared wrapper or shell. And inside of them, they're hosting their own pages. So this will become more clear as we start to build out our own routes, but just know for now we have these special layout.tsx and page.tsx file types that correspond to the actual page we're on and any shared common layouts between them. So let's go ahead and firstly clean up the default JSX that the Next.js CLI has created for us. I want to go ahead and just remove all of this boilerplate code since I just want to start off fresh and simply output some empty tags. I also want to go to the globals.css and remove all of this boilerplate CSS and keep the Tailwind directives since these are actually going to load in our Tailwind CSS library. Now, of course, if we go back to our homepage, we can see we have this ugly white screen, but it means our component is actually rendering nothing right now, which is what I want, a clean slate as we start building out our app. Next up, I want to actually get Material UI, a really good material component library that we can use on Next.js to build out a beautiful UI very easily. Let's go ahead and set that up so we can get a dark theme set up and get rid of this ugly white background. Let's go ahead and get started on that next. So next, we're going to install Material UI, the world's most popular React UI framework. That's going to give us a library of good-looking reusable components we can use out of the box to build a great-looking and functioning React app. And it's built completely mobile first, so it's totally responsive, helping us to build a really great UI without much effort. So back in VS Code, I've gone ahead and opened a terminal so I can npm install the dependencies we need. So we're going to need MUI/material, emotion/react, emotion/styled, at MUI/material-next.js, and finally emotion/cache. And I'll make sure we go ahead and save these dependencies as dependencies in our package.json after we finish installing them. All right, so now that we have the dependencies we need, we have to provide a global wrapper around our entire application that Material UI system is going to use to actually collect the CSS necessary to display our MUI components on the Next.js server. So to do this, we're going to edit our common root layout.tsx, which, as we know, is going to be the root component for our application that's going to wrap all other components, since this is the root layout.tsx component. Therefore, we can simply go inside of our existing body, and let's open this up so we can add a new component. And this is going to be the app router cache provider component. And then we'll take the children, which are all the other components in our application, and make sure they're included inside this cache provider as children. So go ahead and add this import from MUI/material Next.js/v13-app router. So this is going to ensure that our styles are going to be appended to the head of our HTML document, which is exactly what we want. So next up, I want to set up a theme for our application so that we have a nice dark theme. So to do this, I'm going to go to our app root, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new dark.theme.ts file. And in here, we're going to go ahead and now write our actual theme. So the first step in creating our theme is to first up tell our Next.js app, specifically the actual compiler, or in this case, the dev server, that the file we're about to write needs to be actually run at runtime on the client side. Now, of course, you'll know that Next.js, the whole architecture behind it, is that it's able to run our UI application on the server side, generate the HTML we need, and then send it back to the client. We're going to go in depth more on the concept of these server components and client components, the difference between the two, and when and where we're actually going to use them. However, for now, we need to just understand that this theme file that we're creating, well, we want it to be compiled on the client side, not the server, which is the default functionality in Next.js. Our files and components are going to be rendered on the server. Well, in this case, we want it to be rendered on the client. So in order to instruct Next.js to do this, we need to simply provide the use client syntax. Now Next.js knows to only use this specific file on the client side. And that's because the MUI library that we're about to use is written for the client and not the server. So we need to ensure that Next.js does so. Now let's go ahead and create a const called dark theme and set it equal to create theme from MUI/material. Next up, we're going to supply an options object where we can provide a palette. So here we can supply a mode now. And now I'm going to supply the dark mode as our default palette or color scheme for our theme. Let's go ahead and export default this dark theme so we can use it elsewhere in our application. All right, so now that we have our theme set up, let's go back to our root layout.tsx. And so now what I want to do is I want to, in addition to rendering the children here inside of our app router cache provider, I want to now use another provider from MUI material called the theme provider. So go ahead and import this. Then we'll go ahead and put the children inside of here once again. And now for the theme provider, we can actually provide a theme prop to it. And now I'm going to supply the dark theme that we created. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and also add the CSS baseline component the Material UI offers us, which is going to simply introduce some baseline styles and resets to our HTML page, which is what I want. So to do this, we'll just use the CSS baseline component. Additionally, I'm going to introduce the container component from MUI/material. A container component is simply a box with a bit of margin and padding around it. And what this is going to do is it's going to ensure that our web application only has a max width on it, so that when our screen size gets so large, our app's not going to keep growing. It's going to have a max width, which is what I want. I don't want it to keep on going forever. So we're going to have this container to get some nice spacing and enforce this max width, which looks good on all screen sizes. It's responsive out of the box. So we'll go ahead and move this inside of the container. So now at this point, if we go back to our application, we can actually see the background of our web app has changed to a dark color, and that's because Material UI is now picking up on our dark theme, which is excellent. Now that we have a dark theme out of the box, let's go ahead and start building out our authentication components and dive deeper into the idea of rendering in Next.js, specifically the difference between server and client components, which we touched on briefly in this lecture. Let's do that in the next lecture. So as we discussed before, the idea of server components in Next.js is that we are actually rendering and optionally caching our React components on the server side and then sending them back to the client. So essentially we're doing the rendering work on the server. Now there's several benefits associated with this, including data fetching closer to our actual data source, security by allowing us to keep sensitive data and logic such as keys and tokens on the server. We have caching because Next.js can actually reuse and cache the results of our rendering requests across users. And we can also keep JavaScript dependencies that would load our UI on the server. Now, the best part about server components in Next.js is that they're opted in by default. So we don't need to do anything. We're just going to start building components and they're going to be rendered on the server to take advantage of these benefits. Only when we specifically need to opt out to use client components, well, we need to do that by, again, using that syntax we saw earlier by having the use client syntax to tell Next.js to render our component on the UI, which is useful in cases where we have components that need a lot of interactivity, since that by default, server components can't use state, effects, and event listeners. They need to happen on these client components. So when we need to opt in to client components, we're going to use this syntax of use client. So now that we've discussed the difference between server and client components, let's go ahead and get started on building our first route in our application to actually authenticate the user. I want to build a login and sign up form. So we know that routing in Next.js is file-based. So in order to create a new route, and we're simply going to create a folder in the app directory with the name of the route. So in this case, I want to have a subroute called Auth. And now within Auth, I want to have two routes. I want to have a sign up. So I'm going to create a sign up folder. And then I'm going to create a login folder. So in Next.js, the router is going to look for a page.tsx file first in Auth and then in login or sign up, depending on the route we're on, to actually publicly expose these routes to the end user. Currently, we don't have this page.tsx created. So now if we actually tried going to this newly created route of /auth/login, for example, we're going to get a 404 because Next.js can't find the page.tsx within this directory. Let's go ahead and fix this by creating a page.tsx within login. And then I'm simply going to paste in the home component and rename this login. So we're just going to simply render a empty component so that we can show that we can now actually route to this component. And we can, right? We're on /auth/login now and actually not getting a 404 because the Next.js router can finally find a page.tsx file in this login route. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for sign up. I'll create a page.tsx and we'll paste in a component and change this to sign up. So now at this point, we can go to /auth/signup as well and see no 404. We have our empty component, which is just what we'd expect. Now, before we go ahead and actually create the underlying routes or page.tsx files for our sign up and login pages, I want to create a common layout.tsx that's going to host both components. Now we know we can accomplish this easily with Next.js's app router thanks to its tree hierarchical based routing system, where if we supply a parent layout.tsx in this auth directory, this is the layout.tsx that's going to render all subpages or page.tsx components inside of this. So the page.tsx in login and signup, both will be rendered inside of this common layout.tsx. And we know, of course, the root layout.tsx hosts everything. So all we have to do is export default a new component in here. So let's do that. We'll export default function auth layout. Now auth layout is going to get passed in the children. So just like in the root layout.tsx, we are going to get the children props, which are all of the additional child pages or layouts. So we know this is going to be a children prop of type react.react node. And we're going to go ahead and now return a JSX expression. In our case, I want to use the Material UI box component. So the box component is simply a container component, essentially the simplest component we have in Material UI with no default styles applied to it. And now I want to go ahead and actually use Tailwind CSS to center our login and sign up forms or components directly in the middle of the screen. Now we can use Tailwind's utility classes. I'll leave a link in this lecture where you can read the documentation and find all the utility classes we have available. Essentially, for each CSS rule, we have a Tailwind helper class instead that will correspond to it. So instead of having to write our own CSS and CSS class names, which can be totally arbitrary, we can just use these utility classes. So let's give this box component a class name property. And now let's apply the utility classes we need to actually center this component. So we're going to use height screen to make the actual box the height of our viewport or screen. And then we're going to use flexbox. So we have flex, item center to align item center, and finally justify center to align everything in the middle. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and render the children inside of this centered box. So now login and sign up pages are both going to be rendered inside of here thanks to this child-based routing. Let's go into the login page and start building out our component here. So inside of this login form, I want my components to be aligned vertically. So to do this, we can use a stack from Material UI/material, which is going to allow us to align components in a stack where each component will be on essentially a new line, you can think of it. We can also go ahead and give some spacing to the stack, so that's the amount of space in between the items inside of it. So this is going to be similar to just a flex box with flex direction set to column. That's essentially all it's doing. For the spacing, I'll give it a spacing of 2. And then the class name is going to be, well, I want to use some Tailwind utility classes and set the width to full width on this stack. This means that the stack is going to take up its full parent width. However, we're only ever going to get up to the extra small screen size. In the case of Tailwind CSS, that's around 480 pixels. So that's going to make sure our forms don't stretch and look very weird on larger dimensions. Let's go ahead and now supply a text field as well. So the text field is a component in Material UI we can use. It's essentially just a wrapper around the normal input. However, we have great styling inside of it instead. So this text field, I'll give it a label of email. So that's the first field we're going to take in from the user. It's their email. And then I want to supply the variant. So the type of Material UI input, they have a few different flavors of it. I want the outline variant. Finally, let's go ahead and say that the type for this input is an email, so we have special validation. And so now we have this input inside of this stack. Let's go ahead and copy this text field and so that we can paste it in a few more times, as I want another text field, but now I want this to be the password. So the password is what the user is going to supply us to authenticate. I'm going to keep everything the same except change the type to a password. Now, of course, we also need a button to actually submit this. Now we also need a button to actually submit the credentials. So we can use the Material UI button component. And inside of this button, I'll have a text that says login. I'll also go ahead and use a variant of type contained to give it a nice style. Next up, we want to supply a link underneath our login button that's going to say sign up that the user can click to go directly to the sign up form so that they can create an account if they don't already have one. So routing in Next.js is very simple. We can just simply supply an href prop to their link component, and the Next.js router will take care of navigating us to the correct component. Now I also want this Next.js link to have our material UI styles. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and explicitly import the Next.js link as next link from next/link. So I'm going to give it an alias name here. And that's because I now want to use the link component from MUI/material to actually style it correctly. And then what we can do is we can actually supply a component prop to it and say what's the underlying component we want to actually use for the link. Well, in our case, that's going to be the next link, which is going to handle our routing. I'm going to go ahead and provide sign up for the text inside of the link and then give it an href to /auth/signup, which we know is going to correspond to our file-based router where we have the auth folder and then the signup folder with our page.tsx component inside, which makes it publicly accessible. Finally, I'll use a class name to give it a centered alignment, so we'll use self-center here. So now at this point, we should be able to go back to our UI and let's go ahead and navigate to auth/login. So now we can actually see this really nice looking login form that is being rendered and of course centered in the screen thanks to our common layout.tsx. And then we have our input fields here for the email and password, as well as the login button and a link to the sign up page. So you can see here, if we click it, we do get navigated to sign up. Now, as I previously mentioned, all of these components we're creating in Next.js by default are server components. So these components are actually being rendered and sent back from us on the server side, which, as I explained before, has a number of benefits, including caching, security, and more. It's going to make actually rendering these common components where things don't change much from component to component really fast to render, since we're not rendering them on the client each time. So next, let's go ahead and do the same thing for our signup component. I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this existing JSX from login and go back to the page.tsx for signup. Let's go ahead and paste this in now, and we'll go ahead and copy over all of the imports as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and update this because I want the link now to actually say login so that we can go to the login component if we need to sign in. So we'll then change the href to auth/login instead, and we'll change the button text to sign up. So now if we go back to auth/login and click on sign up, we're brought to the sign up page and we see the sign up form that we have being rendered here. And of course, it's the same exact common layout.tsx that's rendering between these and not re-rendering each time as we navigate. A really nice benefit to this app router. It's just the page.tsx components that are changing each time. So now at this point, we're successfully rendering these components on the server, and we're ready to start actually getting into data fetching on our backend to actually create a new user so we can authenticate with them. Of course, we're going to have to set up our backend and then go through how to use data fetching in Next.js. Let's go ahead and get started in the next lecture. I'll see you there. All right, so we're ready to go ahead and get started with setting up our backend that our Next.js app will actually talk to. So in this course, we're going to use NestJS as our backend, which is a very popular Node.js framework that makes it really easy to get up and running with REST APIs and CRUD functionality built with a very clean architecture.